This is the Carlin Studio, and I am your host, Charles Lathrop, and today we're going to do part 2 of the Incoherence of Atheism. And in part 1, I covered, historical proofs and sort of, logical proofs and things like this in terms of how the supposed conflict between Christianity and science is often framed and how it's often, approached. And I didn't touch on evolution, and I am going to talk about it now. Now, evolution is more than any other scientific, theory or idea that is out there, comes the closest to actually challenging Christianity in any meaningful way. As I've said previously, the vast majority of the arguments and sorts of propositions that secularists put forward to try and disprove God are basically non-sequiturs. They don't have anything to do with Christianity. They don't really mean anything. Evolution doesn't really fall squarely into that category. If evolution is true, it does create really serious problems for Christianity. However, it's not. It actually isn't. It can't be. Now, immediately it's, I'm an idiot, I don't know what I'm talking about, the science is settled. And the thing that needs to be understood is that this knee-jerk reaction, this compulsion, this impulse, that anybody who questions evolution is a heretic, is a religious, zealous religiosity impulse. All right? So secularism has created the Church of Evolution. Chance is their god, and anybody who questions evolution is a heretic and needs to be burned at the stake of public opinion. Right? You're stupid for even daring to think that evolution may not be entirely accurate. And it's sort of an emperor has no clothes situation, because so many people for so long have so invested themselves into this idea, they've become so entrenched in it that no matter what evidence is presented to them in any context, they're going to funnel everything through the lens that they have determined is the truth. Starting with evolution, all right, how does life even start in the first place is an extremely good question. And it is not the focus of this video, but I'm going to get it out of the way real fast, all right? Sir Fred Hoyle, who is an atheist, said that the odds of life arising from primordial soup are like the odds of a hurricane blowing through a junkyard and forming a fully functional Boeing 747. Now, I've made a number of, analogies like this, but this is an analogy that an atheist has actually used to describe life as we know it arising from non-life. All right? It's physically impossible. Mathematicians, physicists, they know if it's beyond a certain probability, it doesn't happen. The probability of life arising by chance is so low, it is 1 against a number that is larger than the number of electrons that you could fit in the known universe. All right? It's an astronomically huge probability to overcome just to get life in the first place. So if you don't believe in supernatural events, I hope you don't believe in your own existence, because that's the only explanation that I can come up with for this, according to our scientific understanding. Now, moving beyond, where did life come from in the first place? How does life get into the form that we know it? Okay? We cannot observe at any time life coming from nothing. So it's not really science because it's not observable. But further than this, for as long as evolution has been around, people have been observing bacteria. They've been observing bacteria mutate. They've been observing bacteria grow and multiply. And for 80 plus years or longer, as long as we've had microscopes to detect them, we have never ever observed any bacteria transform into another species of bacteria. All the species of bacteria that exist today are the same species of bacteria that have existed since we started observing them. There is no evolution observable at the most rapidly reproducing level of life, the bacteria. It is not observable. It's not observable, ergo, it's not science. It's not science. You can believe it if you want to, but it's not science because it can't be observed. It can't be tested. Now, the physical proof, okay, the archaeology, the geology, all right. You go out to somewhere like the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon is a great example. Everybody's seen pictures of it. Many people have been there. All right, you go to the Grand Canyon, look at the Grand Canyon. All right, that place, all the layers of rock, every single one of them is perfectly flat. Perfectly. Completely flat. Just stacked right on top of each other. And we are asked to believe that these each represent, thousands, millions of years. So, over the course of several 100 million years, each of these layers of rock suffered perfectly uniform erosion across hundreds of thousands of miles in every direction. Because those layers of rock are perfectly flat everywhere. Everywhere they appear, they're perfectly flat. They're perfectly uniform, every single one of them stacked on top of each other. Okay? And hundreds of millions of years of erosion didn't produce, not perfectly flat layers of rock. All right? I'm not going to get into the explanations for why it may be the way it is. All right? You can, research that for yourself. But I will say that the idea that these represent millions and millions of years is patently absurd. It's the emperor has no clothes. It's clearly not the case. It cannot possibly be, because erosion does not allow such perfectly flat layers of rock to exist. It doesn't happen. All right? They're not representing millions and millions of years. Well, we know they represent millions of years because of the radiocarbon dating. Now, the interesting thing about radiocarbon dating is that it measures the amount of radiation that is in an object, okay? And it based on the half-lives of the radiation that exists in the object, they project backwards how long the radiation has been decaying. Sounds reasonable, right? Well, the problem is that in order for this to work, you have to have a closed system. Your sample has to be closed. It can't have any outside interference at all. It can have any radiation added, any radioactive materials added over time, or any radioactive materials removed. And we don't know whether or not the fossils we have, we don't know that the fossils we have been closed systems. In fact, we know they have not been closed systems. We know they haven't been because they've been out in the world, exposed to all sorts of things that we have no idea. For who knows how long. All right? We don't know. We don't know what they've been exposed to. We know that they're not closed systems. So then you have to know how much radiation, how much radioactive material it began with. We don't know that either. And all we know really is the rate of decay. And so, based on the layer of the rock that it's in, they project that it must be between certain ages, and then they radiocarbon date it, and they're like, well, it had this much decay, so there must have been this much of this radioactive material in it to begin with. But we don't know that all of it was still there the entire time, that it wasn't washed out by water or any other myriad of factors. All right? If you radiocarbon date something which has a known age, radiocarbon dating is completely useless. If you already know what the age is, radiocarbon dating is useless. Completely useless. If you don't know what the age is, then it's completely accurate. This is the thinking of these people. I'm not kidding. You research this. That's how radiocarbon dating works. They assign the ages based on how old they think it should be in order to fit into the emperor has no clothes theory. All right? Further than this, in order to have a fossil, a creature has to be buried extremely quickly, okay? Because if it's exposed for an 18th of time, all right, it's going to be eaten, it's going to be torn apart, it's going to decompose, it's going to be crushed. Numerous things can happen to it, all right? I live in the country, and there's a lot of roadkill. Some years, much more roadkill than others, and this is one of those years. And I gotta tell you, those bodies do not last. You're not gonna get fossils from those things, okay? It's not gonna happen, okay? Because they start decomposing immediately. As soon as they hit the ground, they start decomposing, they start breaking down. Those bones don't last. None of it lasts, and it certainly doesn't last in the configuration of a fully formed skeleton, all right? But they dig up these fully formed skeletons, these fully configured skeletons. These things were buried almost as soon as they died, immediately. That's the only way you get that. There is a place where a whale, a type of whale, I forget the name, it might be extinct now, it probably is. But there's a place, a bay, used to be covered in water, where there are hundreds of the skeletons of these whales all over the floor of that bay. Okay? Hundreds of them. All perfectly preserved. All of them, their skeletons just right there. All of them are perfectly preserved. Now, as quickly as the bodies out on the road decompose, the ocean is even worse. As soon as a whale dies, there are 100 million things around it that are immediately going to start eating it and tearing it apart. In order to get hundreds of whales buried, perfectly preserved, and all of their skeletons completely intact, you have to have some kind of catastrophic event that buried them all and killed them all almost immediately, almost instantaneously. That's the only way that this makes sense. All right. Now, I think it's in Spain or somewhere on the Iberian Peninsula. I'm sure it's a very famous site. I don't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but I actually want you look it up. Look this up. It should not be that hard to look up. Look it up. How do you get all of those skeletons, all perfectly preserved, all perfectly buried, all fossilized, all at once in the same location at the same level of elevation, at the same level? It doesn't happen in the processes that evolutionists would have you believe. Okay, it doesn't happen. They are missing something massive, and it's staring them right in the face, and they have no idea. They just don't see it. They just don't look at it because they have a predetermined conclusion. Okay, now let's get into. We've talked about the physical evidence. Let's get into biology. Let's get into the actual, how does evolution actually happen? All right. The theory is that mutations occur, and as mutations occur, over time, natural selection eliminates bad mutations and leaves good ones. All right. Now, the first thing that you need to understand is evolution is random. Okay? It's a random process. Now, many people will say, no, it's not random. Natural selection isn't random. No, natural selection isn't random. But mutation is. Mutation is completely random. It is fully random all the time. Okay? That's why that's part of the definition of mutation. All right? Mutation is fully random. And so, in order to get something like, I don't know, the hand, you have to have fully random mutations. Thousands of them. Hundreds of thousands of fully random mutations. And each and every single one of those mutations has to be so advantageous that it is not either bred out or hunted to extinction. Okay? Because natural selection doesn't create information. It only destroys information. It only destroys negative traits. It doesn't create positive ones. It only kills things. It doesn't make things. Mutation is the thing that they claim makes things. Mutation is where they claim all of this new information comes from. Now, I've already stated, in all the time that we've been observing bacteria, we haven't observed the emergence of a single new species of bacteria. Not a single one. However, all right, looking past that for a moment, in order for natural selection to work, there has to be completely new, fully positive mutations that are such an improvement on the previous generation that the new generation totally outcompetes the previous generation. Totally overtakes them. Okay? And it has to be an incremental process that happens over millions of years. Every single new mutation has to be fully positive in its effects, because otherwise it'll just be bred out of existence or hunted to extinction, because that's what natural selection does. So how do you get, by incremental mutation, a wing? Because in order for the wing to work as a wing, it has to be the full wing. Whenever you take one little piece out of that wing, you don't get a wing that flies half as well. You just get a useless appendage that doesn't do anything. Whenever you have a cut on your arm, all right, that scab that forms over your wound, all right, that scab forms in an enormously complicated process of chemical reactions and blood clotting and everything else. It's very, very complicated. And people who have one or two things wrong with that process will bleed to death if they're not properly treated. They'll bleed to death because their body isn't forming the scab correctly. Okay? That super complicated multi-step process, all right? You take one element out of it. You don't get a scab that stops the bleeding half as well. You just die, okay? In order for the scabbing to work, it has to be fully functional day one. Or you just bleed to death, okay? It has to be fully functional immediately or you're just dead. The four-chambered heart, all right? The stomachs of the cow, okay? The eyeball. All of these things basically fit into the same category. The most simple human cell that has the flagella, it has the little tail on the end of it that it uses to swim, all right? That flagella has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of individual little pieces inside of it, individual little mechanisms inside of it. All right? In order for that cell to swim, every single one of those pieces has to work exactly correctly. If you remove one of those pieces out of the flagella, you don't get a cell that swims half as well. It just doesn't work. All right? It just doesn't happen. It has to be fully functioning day one in order for it to exist at all. None of these things can occur as the result of incremental processes over time. None of these things could possibly arise from hundreds of thousands of individual mutations, all of which have to be individually positive, individually good in terms of their effects on the survival of the species. Okay? If what would become a bird starts to mutate the beginnings of a wing, All right, it's not a wing yet. It's not going to start gliding. Okay? It just has a stub on its back. All right? The stub has to be useful. Has to increase its chances of survival. How do you get from that stub through every single incremental process into a fully formed wing? How do you get from a stub into a wing? All right? It doesn't happen. It can't happen. It's inconceivable. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, this guy's such an idiot. They've already figured this stuff out. Yeah, a lot of people have figured this out, including Darwin, who towards the end of his life said, I can't conceive of how the eye, as complicated as it is, could possibly have been formed through incremental changes over time. Because if you remove one piece of the eye, if you remove a single mutation, you don't get an eye that sees half as well. You just don't get an eye. It's just a globule of flesh. It's useless. Charles Darwin says this. All right? Smart people have been thinking about this for a very long time. All right? And smart people have come to some wildly erroneous conclusions about it. Because it's the emperor who has no clothes. All right? They will fit anything they can possibly find into their predetermined conclusion. And just completely ignore everything else. And if you question it, if you say anything about it, if you say this doesn't make any sense, this doesn't fly, this doesn't hold water, all right, you're a heretic. And you must be burned at the stake. This is the attitude of secularists in the scientific community who believe in evolution. They're the new ecclesiarchy. They're the ecclesiarchy of the Church of Evolution. That's what they are. All right? This is not an exaggeration. This is actually the way that it is. And you might be inclined to say, well, different breeds of dogs. They're all different. That's evolution in progress. The thing that you need to understand is every single one of the different breeds of dogs, all of the wolves, the dingoes in Australia, every single one of the different breeds of dogs, they are, in their genotype, completely identical. The genotype is the same. It's exactly the same. It's only the phenotype that's different. That's the only thing that's changed. Just the phenotype. Just the genes that are expressed. And what can we learn from this? Well, something very interesting, which is that all of the variations of dogs that we now see in the world, all of the genetic material that goes into Pomeranians and Great Danes and Golden Retrievers and all the rest of them, every single one of them, all of those traits exist within the wolf. It's just that they're not expressed. They're not expressed because the wolves express the phenotype that is most advantageous to the way that they live. The phenotype of human beings can vary wildly across the planet. Okay? But you wouldn't say that we're separating into different species. The way that people might claim that horses and dogs, different horse breeds and dog breeds, are separating into different species. You can clearly see that's obviously not the case. Things adapt to their environment according to the genetic code that they already have. It is all pre-existing information. All of the adaptations, all of the changes in phenotype, all the different skin colors of human beings to adapt to the different levels of sunlight that they get across the world. Because if you didn't know, the reason white people are white is because in Europe you don't get as much sunlight. So you get lighter skin in order to absorb enough vitamin D. In Africa, you get an enormous amount of sunlight, so your skin gets darker to absorb less vitamin D, so it doesn't overload your body. All right? But all of those things, all of that stuff, all of the different changes in the phenotype, okay, all of it is in the genetic code of all human beings, all right? The genotype has not changed at all. It's only the things that are expressed that has changed. This adaptation will never lead to evolution. It's not evolution, it's just adaptation. So the finches on the Galapagos Islands, they get different kinds of beaks based on what they need to eat. All right, it's like, well, this is going to lead to evolution. No, okay, they adapt, but they're always finches because they're finches. They're always going to be finches. They're never going to transform into something else. All right, it doesn't happen. It never happens. It can't happen because the genetic code doesn't exist. In order for a species to become a different species, you have to have an entirely new set of instructions, of genetic instructions. Mutate out of nowhere, from nothing, and be fully functional and survive without any outside interference. All right? Atheists claim that they don't believe in supernatural, but evolution is the most supernatural thing that I have ever heard of. In order to believe in evolution, you already believe in the supernatural, because it's Alice in Wonderland out there. Okay, it's insanity. It's so absurd. It's beyond belief. How is it? How is it that no one has seen through this? You might be asking yourself, well, surely, Charles Lathrop, okay, he's smart, but really, surely if you thought of this, somebody else thought of it, and so they had the answer. Even if I don't believe in God, but even if I don't know the answer to all the objections that you're bringing up, Charles, that doesn't mean that there aren't answers out there. It doesn't mean that you're right. And the thing that you need to understand is, these people don't want to believe in God. In their own words, they don't want there to be a God. You see, it's not about evolution. It's not about multiple universes or anything else. It's about rejecting God. That's what it's about. Okay? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. The evidence doesn't matter to them. The actual facts, the actual science doesn't matter to them. They claim science all the time, but the science is against them. They don't care about science. It's a cloak. It's a veil. It's an act. It's kabuki theater. They put on the science mask because that's the mask that secularism is wearing in this age. The other day, there was a very popular speaker who was talking about Christianity and how, Christianity is declining because of science. He's like, why did we ever believe any of the stuff in the Bible in the first place? And I'm like, you didn't. All the people that were like you in all the previous ages didn't believe it back then either. It's just that now you have a brand new excuse. And evolution is one of the best excuses that secularists have ever come up with. But the secularist is nothing new. They've always been around. It's just that now they have rationalism to use as a veil. That's the only thing that's changed. This has been the Carlinine Studio, and I have been your host, Charles Lathrop. God bless.